Hey guys, do a quick lesson today on division and fractions with negative numbers. Not going to be a lot new in this. It's sort of combining some things you already know in a way that may look new and remind you of some things. So go ahead, please, mark this title in your math notebook, next free page. And when you've done that, close that up and concentrate with me until we get to the we do, and then you can open it back up. Alright, a couple things I want to review today. We've talked about some types of numbers. So we talked about the natural numbers. And those were like the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. We also talked about integers. That was all of these plus 0. And their opposites. So these were new when we started talking about negative numbers. And then we've also talked about rational numbers. Remember, rational numbers are any number that can be written as a fraction. They don't have to be written as a fraction, but they could be. So for instance, like 2/3 or 6/5. Those are obviously rational numbers because they're written as a fraction. But like whole numbers are too, like -4, that still is a rational number because I could write it as a fraction. And 23/100ths, excuse me, 23/100ths is also a rational number because I could write it 23/100ths as a fraction if I wanted to. So any number that can be written possibly as a fraction is a rational number, which basically is pretty much all the numbers you know of. So that's one thing to review. Dividing natural numbers, we've talked in number talks about dividing two natural numbers, kind of like this, and knowing that another way I can write that is 5 divided by 8, or 5/8. If I take 5 things and divide it into 8 groups, 5/8 of a thing will be in each group. And it also works if the first number is greater, like 7 divided by 2. If you take 7 things, divide it into 2 groups, 3.5 things would be in each group, or 7/2 of a thing. So that's a quick way to divide natural numbers. And we've also done division with negatives. Remember, a negative divided by a positive is negative. You can switch that and get the same. A positive divided by a negative is also negative. And a negative divided by a negative is positive. So don't forget that. So all this is going to kind of come into play today. All right. So let me show you a few. So let's talk about division with negatives, also in a way that deals with that strategy we learned in the number talk. So let's talk about -6 divided by 8. If I were to answer that as simply as possible, I would just say, well, that's -6/8. And that's probably all I would do. -6 divided by 8, I can write another way. I know, looking at my signs, negative divided by positive, I know that that's going to have a negative answer. We'll come back to that in a sec. Same thing here. 6 divided by -8, I would probably just write as 6 divided by -8. And again, I also know that's going to have a negative answer. So one of the things I want you to come away with today is these should be the same, right? They're both 6/8, and they're both negative. So when it comes to a negative fraction or a negative rational number, this and this, these are all the same. These are 3 different ways to write the fraction -6 eighths. Because this I would naturally turn into this. This I would naturally turn into this. And both of them, if I thought about it, I would say, okay, 6 divided by 8 is 6/8. And since one number is negative, it's negative. So I could write it this way, or this way, or this way. Those are all the same thing. You'll rarely see it written this way. Most of the time, even if somebody asks you what's 6 divided by -8, they'll either write it like this or sometimes like this. But it doesn't matter which, and you can move between them if somehow this is more helpful than others. These are all three the exact same number. All right, this one's a little different. -6 divided by -8. If I use my number talk kind of 5th grade division trick, that's -6 divided by -8. But I know that this, -6 divided by -8, I know that that's going to be a positive number because it's division of two negatives. So rather than writing that like that, it would probably be best to write it as that. Two negatives, -6 divided by -8, if they're both negative, it's still the same number, but it's easier to think of it being positive. I know it's going to be positive from this, so I would rather write it this way than this way, because that looks just too confusing. Okay, I also want to go the other way with this. So looking at this, if I want to start with the fraction and think about what it means, notice I said in the last slide, all three of these are the same. They don't look the same necessarily, but all of them are -3/4. Whether you put the negative sign here with the numerator or the denominator, it's like I'm saying 3 divided by 4 and make the answer negative, or -3 divided by 4, which would be negative. 3 divided by -4, which would be negative. All these would come up with a negative number, and that number would be 3/4. So if I look at them, I'm going to know they're the same. This one looks to me obviously like -3 divided by 4. And this one looks obviously to me like 3 divided by -4. This one, I just have to know that that's one of these. Because really what I'm saying in this one is divide 3 by 4 and take its opposite, which is kind of a strange way to write it, but it's like the opposite of 3 divided by 4. All three of these give you this, though. So you can move back and forth between any of these that you want, is really what I want you to know. That all this, the order that the signs and exactly how you put the sign doesn't matter. If you want a negative fraction, all this is fine. This one, two things I want you to know about this. That is -3 divided by -4. But we know that the reason I would point this out is we know that that's going to be positive. And -3 divided by -4, we know it's a positive answer, and 3 divided by 4 is 3/4. So when you see, if you ever see a double negative fraction, it's kind of weird, but that's really the same thing as the positive fraction. Just all this division and fraction business, it just all goes together. It can be a little confusing to be comfortable moving back and forth however you want, but it works. All right, let's try some together. Open your math notebook. So let's first go with sort of division of division of negative numbers to make a rational numbers kind of problem. So this, my first thing to see here is I would think of that as being -9/7 like this. And I would think of this one as being -9/7 like this. So what I really want you to know, though, that's the technically right way to do it. These are the same. And they're also both the same as writing it like this. It just doesn't matter. Same. All three of these are fine ways to write a negative fraction. 3 ways to write a negative fraction. All those are okay. And if you get this and you want to change it to this, that's fine. If you get this and you want to change it to this, that's fine. Just want you to know all these are the same. It's 9 divided by 7, which is 9/7, and the whole thing is negative. So negative 9/7. I could just ignore this for a minute, do my 9 divided by 7 and get this, and say, well, because of my signs, the answer is negative, so I want to write it like that. It's all the same. This one is a little different. That's negative 9 divided by negative 7. But since this is both negative, we know that the answer here would be positive if we divided these. So a double negative fraction is the same as a positive fraction. Because I would do 9 divided by 7 is 9/7, and my answer would be positive because they're both negative. So if you see a fraction like this, it's the same as the positive fraction, and it's a lot easier to look at and deal with the positive fraction. So all that's important, and that's kind of how that works, okay? Let's go the other way. Looking at all of these, are different combinations of 5 divided by 2, which that's negative. So let's start with these middle two are the easiest to understand, right? That's negative 5 divided by 2. That is 5 divided by negative 2. And I told you in the last one, these 3 were all the same. Right? Negative 5/2 this way, negative 5/2 this way, negative 5/2 this way. They all have the same value. The way I think of this one, which is confusing, is to me it looks like positive 5 divided by positive 2, and I take the opposite of the whole thing. But all these are the same. You can go back and forth any way you want. Any of these things are all the same. It's just different ways to write the same thing, and I just want you to understand why it all means the same thing, why it all works. All of these are just different ways to say negative 2.5. Doesn't matter if I have 5 things in negative 2 groups, negative 5 things in 2 groups, or I just do the positive groups and then divide them in half. This one's different though. So, you can have, if you have one negative sign, be it out here, here, or here, same thing. This, not so much. What this really represents is negative 5 divided by negative 2. And if you were to do that division problem, you would say, okay, since they're both negative, the answer is positive. And 5 divided by 2 is 2.5 or 5/2. So really this becomes equal to the positive version of the same number. Negative 5 divided by negative 2 is the same as positive 5/2, which is weird, but I think when you look at it this way through some steps, you kind of know. All right, so that's how division involving negatives and fractions and all that can get very confusing, and I definitely think it is. So if you're sitting there right now and you're pretty confused, I would definitely recommend going back and thinking through some of this a second time. We'll do some more examples in You Do Together and stuff tomorrow, and hopefully after we've done all that, you'll kind of have the hang of it. A lot of it just takes experience and just getting used to how all this works. None of the math is hard. It's just a matter of figuring out what sign goes where and what do these things mean. You don't have to do a lot of calculating. All right, so go back and check it out again if you need to. If you feel like you get this after all, well, you're all set, and I will see you tomorrow.